The smell of pot roast filled the cramped kitchen of Sarah's duplex in suburban Cincinnati, Ohio. October rain drummed against the windows as she stirred gravy with one hand while balancing her phone against her ear with the other. Her daughter Emma, 16 and all elbows and attitude, sat at the small dining table doing homework, her blonde hair falling like a curtain around her face. "No, Mom, I told you we'd be fine," Sarah said into the phone, her voice carrying that familiar strain of trying to keep peace. "David's just running late from work." Emma looked up from her calculus homework, rolling her eyes. "Tell Grandpa I said hi," she said, not looking up from her textbook. Sarah covered the phone. "Dad wants to know if you're still planning to apply to Ohio State." "I'm 17, Mom. I can make my own decisions about college," Emma shot back, her voice sharp with the kind of irritation that came from having this conversation too many times. The front door slammed, and David's heavy footsteps echoed through the house. Sarah's stomach tightened. She could tell by the way his boots hit the floor that work hadn't gone well. David Martinez had been her husband for 3 years now, and she'd learned to read his moods like weather patterns. "I gotta go, Dad. David's home." Sarah hung up and turned toward the hallway. "Honey, how was your day?" David appeared in the kitchen doorway, his construction uniform dirty and his face drawn with exhaustion. At 38, he was a good man who worked hard, but the stress of supporting a family on a contractor's salary showed in the lines around his eyes. "Foreman laid off 6 guys today," he said, running a hand through his dark hair. "Could be more next week." Sarah's heart sank. They were already behind on the car payment, and Emma needed money for her SAT prep course. "Oh, David, I'm so sorry. Come eat. I made your favorite." Emma glanced up from her homework as David slumped into the chair across from her. "That sucks about work," she said, and Sarah felt a flicker of pride at her daughter's attempt at empathy. "Thanks, kid," David said, managing a tired smile. "How's school?" "Fine," Emma said, which was her standard response to any adult question. Sarah served the pot roast, trying to keep the conversation light. The rain outside had picked up, and the old house creaked in the wind. She'd grown up in this neighborhood, knew every crack in the sidewalk, every family story behind every front door. Her father lived just 8 blocks away, in the same house where she'd learned to walk, learned to ride a bike, learned to keep quiet when grown-ups were talking. "Emma got an A on her English paper," Sarah offered, sitting down with her own plate. "That's great, Em," David said, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. Emma shrugged. "It was just on The Great Gatsby. Pretty easy stuff. When I was your age, I was grateful to pass English," David said, cutting into his meat. "College wasn't really an option for kids like me." "Yeah, well, times change," Emma said, not looking up from her food. Sarah felt the familiar tension building. Emma didn't mean to sound dismissive, but her teenage directness sometimes came across as rude. David, stressed about work and sensitive about his background, often took it personally. "What's that supposed to mean?" David asked, his voice taking on an edge. Emma looked up, confused. "What? I just meant that more people go to college now than when you were a kid. It's not a bad thing. So you think you're better than me because you're going to college?" "David," Sarah said quietly, recognizing the warning signs. "She didn't mean—" "No, I want to hear this," David said, setting down his fork. "I want to hear how my stepdaughter thinks she's too good for people like me." Emma's face flushed. "I never said that. God, why do you always twist everything I say?" "Emma," Sarah warned, but her daughter was already fired up. "I'm just trying to have a normal conversation, and you're acting like I personally attacked you or something. I didn't choose to be born into a generation where college is basically required for any decent job." "A decent job?" David's voice rose. "You think what I do isn't decent?" "That's not what I said." Emma's voice cracked with frustration. "You're putting words in my mouth." Sarah felt the familiar panic rising in her chest. She'd grown up in a house where voices were raised, where disagreements turned into battles, where her mother would disappear into the bedroom for hours after her father's temper flared. She'd promised herself Emma would never live like that. "Both of you, please," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Can we just have a nice dinner?" But it was too late. David was standing now, his face red with anger and something deeper, the shame of a man who'd worked construction since he was 18, who'd never had the luxury of planning for college, who felt judged every time Emma talked about her future. "You know what your problem is?" he said, pointing at Emma. "You think the world owes you something. You think because you're smart, you're better than everyone else." Emma stood up too, her chair scraping against the linoleum. "I never said I was better than anyone. You're the one who—" "Emma, sit down," Sarah said, but her daughter wasn't listening. "You're the one who makes everything about yourself," Emma continued, her voice rising. "I can't say anything without you taking it personally. I can't talk about college. I can't talk about my future. I can't even compliment your work without you finding some way to be offended." "That's enough," David said, his voice dangerous and low. "No, it's not enough," Emma shot back. "I'm sick of walking on eggshells in my own house. I'm sick of pretending I don't have dreams just because they make you uncomfortable." And then it happened. David's hand moved faster than thought, faster than Sarah could react. The slap across Emma's face was sharp and loud, cutting through the kitchen like a gunshot. Emma stumbled back, her hand flying to her cheek, her eyes wide with shock and pain. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's heart stopped. Her daughter stood frozen, a red mark already blooming across her fair skin. David's hand was still raised, his face a mixture of anger and immediate regret. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oh my God, David, what did you do?" Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. Instead, she straightened up, looked David directly in the eye, and said with a voice steady as steel, "Don't you ever touch me again." Then she turned and walked out of the kitchen, her footsteps echoing up the stairs. A moment later, her bedroom door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows. Sarah stared at David, her mind reeling. In 3 years of marriage, he'd never laid a hand on either of them. He'd raised his voice, sure, but never this, never violence. "Sarah, David started, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't!" she said, her voice shaking. "Don't you dare!" David slumped back into his chair, his head in his hands. "I didn't mean to. God, Sarah, I didn't mean to." Sarah's phone rang. Without thinking, she answered it. "Hey, sweetheart," her father's voice came through the speaker. "I forgot to ask. How's Emma doing with her college applications?" Sarah looked at David, still sitting with his head in his hands. She looked at the stairs where her daughter had disappeared. She looked at the dinner table where 3 plates sat with food growing cold. "Dad," she said, her voice barely controlled. "Something just happened." "What kind of something?" Sarah closed her eyes, trying to find the words. David hit Emma." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then her father's voice, calm and measured. "Well, someone had to do it." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She looked at the phone in her hand as if it had just turned into a snake. "What did you just say?" "I said someone had to do it," her father repeated. "That girl's been running wild for months, Sarah. No respect for authority, no respect for her elders. Sometimes a teenager needs to learn there are consequences for their mouth." Sarah felt the room spinning around her. This was her father, the man who'd raised her, who'd taught her to ride a bike, who'd walked her down the aisle at her wedding to Emma's father. This was the man who'd held Emma as a baby, who'd taught her to fish, who'd been at every school play and soccer game. "Dad, he hit my daughter," she said, as if saying it again would make him understand. "And maybe now she'll think twice before she disrespects the man who puts a roof over her head," he said. "David works hard for this family, Sarah. The least that girl can do is show some gratitude." Sarah hung up the phone without saying goodbye. She stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the debris of what had been her family dinner, and felt something break inside her chest. The rain continued to fall outside, and somewhere upstairs, her daughter was alone with a bruised face and a shattered sense of safety. David was still sitting at the table, and when he looked up at her, she saw tears in his eyes. "Sarah, please," he said. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me." But Sarah wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the stairs, thinking about her daughter, thinking about the choice she had to make. Because this was the moment everything changed. This was the moment Sarah Matthews had to decide what kind of mother she was going to be. Emma sat on her bed in the dark, her laptop open but forgotten, her hand still pressed to her cheek. The sting had faded, but the memory of David's palm against her face played on repeat in her mind. She'd been slapped before, once, when she was 8, by her biological father during one of his drunken rages. But that was different. That was before her parents divorced, before her father disappeared into a bottle and then disappeared altogether. This was her home. This was supposed to be safe. Through her bedroom door, she could hear muffled voices downstairs. Her mother's voice, high and strained. David's voice, lower, defensive. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the tone. The same tone that had filled this house for months now, a kind of walking on eggshells tension that made every conversation feel like a potential explosion. Emma pulled out her phone and stared at the screen. She had 17 missed messages from her best friend Jessica, mostly about some drama at school that seemed incredibly unimportant now. She started to type a message. "David hit me," but then deleted it. What was she supposed to say? How do you put something like that into words? Instead, she opened her laptop and stared at the college application she'd been working on. The essay question stared back at her. Describe a challenge you've overcome and how it shaped your character. A bitter laugh escaped her throat. Where was she supposed to start? Downstairs, she heard a door slam. Then the house fell silent except for the rain. Emma closed her laptop and lay back on her bed, staring at the ceiling. The water stain above her dresser looked like a map of somewhere she'd never been, somewhere far away from Cincinnati, far away from this house, far away from the complicated mess of trying to be a teenager in a home that never quite felt like home. She thought about her grandfather's house 8 blocks away, where she'd spent so many afternoons after school when she was younger. He'd taught her to play chess on the kitchen table, the same table where he'd eaten every meal for 30 years. He'd told her stories about her grandmother who died when Emma was too young to remember her. He'd been her safe harbor when her parents divorced, the steady presence in a world that seemed to be constantly shifting. Emma picked up her phone and dialed his number. "Grandpa?" she said when he answered. "Emma, sweetheart. How are you doing?" The familiar sound of his voice made her chest tighten. I'm okay. Can I come over?" "Of course, honey. But isn't it a school night? And with this rain..." "Please, Grandpa. I just need to get out of the house for a while." There was a pause. "Is everything all right?" Emma closed her eyes. "David and I got into a fight. I need some space. I'll come pick you up," he said immediately. "Give me 15 minutes." Emma hung up and looked around her room. She grabbed her backpack and stuffed some clothes into it, along with her laptop and phone charger. She wasn't sure how long she'd be gone, but she knew she couldn't stay here tonight. She crept downstairs, avoiding the steps that creaked. The house was dark, except for the light coming from the kitchen, where she could see her mother sitting at the table, still in her work clothes, staring at her phone. Emma thought about going in, about trying to explain what she was feeling, but she couldn't find the words. Instead, she grabbed her jacket from the coat closet and slipped out the front door. Her grandfather was already waiting in his old Buick, the engine running, the windshield wipers fighting against the rain. Frank Matthews was 73 years old, with silver hair and deep lines around his eyes from 40 years of working at the steel mill before it closed down. He'd raised Sarah as a single father after Emma's grandmother died, and Emma had always thought of him as the strongest person she knew. "Come on, sweetheart," he said as she climbed into the passenger seat. "Let's get you out of this rain." Emma buckled her seatbelt and leaned back against the worn fabric seats. The car smelled like her grandfather's aftershave and the peppermint candies he always kept in the center console. It smelled like safety. "You want to tell me what happened?" he asked as they pulled away from the curb. Emma touched her cheek, which still felt tender. "David hit me." Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but his voice remained calm. "He did what?" "We were arguing about college and he got angry and he..." Emma's voice trailed off. Mom called you, didn't she? She did. What did you tell her? Frank was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the road ahead. The rain was coming down harder now, and the old wipers were struggling to keep up. I told her that sometimes teenagers need to learn there are consequences for their actions, he said finally. Emma stared at him, feeling like the world had tilted sideways. Grandpa, what? You've been giving your mother and David a hard time for months, Emma. I've seen it. The eye rolling, the attitude, the way you talk to them like they're beneath you. I don't... Emma started, but Frank held up a hand. Let me finish, he said. I'm not saying David should have hit you, but I am saying that you need to understand that actions have consequences. When you disrespect the people who are trying to take care of you, sometimes those consequences are harsh. Emma felt like she was drowning. Grandpa, he hit me. He slapped me across the face. And I'm sure he feels terrible about it, Frank said. David's a good man, Emma. He works hard, he loves your mother, and he's trying to be a father to you. But you make it impossible for him. I make it impossible. Emma's voice rose. I'm trying to go to college, Grandpa. I'm trying to build a future for myself. How is that making anything impossible? Because you act like you're better than everyone else, Frank said, his voice taking on an edge. You act like your mother's choices aren't good enough for you, like David's not good enough for you, like this whole family isn't good enough for you. Emma stared out the window at the rain, feeling tears start to build behind her eyes. I just want to go to college. And nobody's stopping you from going to college, Frank said, but you don't have to act superior while you're doing it. They drove the rest of the way in silence. Frank's house was exactly as Emma remembered it, small, neat, filled with the kind of furniture that was built to last. The kitchen table where they'd played chess was still there, along with the photo albums stacked on the counter and the calendar on the refrigerator with Emma's school events marked in red ink. You hungry? Frank asked, hanging up his coat. Emma shook her head. I'm not really hungry. How about some tea? Your grandmother's chamomile. Emma nodded, and Frank busied himself with the kettle and cups. Emma sat at the kitchen table and looked around the room. Everything felt smaller than she remembered, more fragile somehow. Grandpa, she said quietly, do you really think I deserve to be hit? Frank set the kettle on the stove and turned to face her. Emma, I think you deserve to learn that your words have power. And sometimes, when you use that power carelessly, people get hurt. But I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, Emma said. I was just trying to have a conversation. Were you? Frank sat down across from her. Or were you trying to prove a point? Were you trying to show David that you're smarter than him? Emma thought about the conversation at dinner, about the way David's face had changed when she talked about college being required for decent jobs. She'd meant it as a general statement about the economy, about how things had changed since he was young. But looking back, she could see how it might have sounded like she was judging him. I didn't mean it like that, she said. Maybe not, Frank said. But impact matters more than intent sometimes, sweetheart. David's been working construction since he was 18 years old. He's proud of what he does, but he also knows that the world looks down on people like him. When you talk about college like it's the only way to have a decent life, you're telling him that his life isn't decent. Emma stared at her hands. I never thought about it like that. I know you didn't, Frank said. That's the problem. You're 17 years old, and you think you know everything about the world, but you don't know what it's like to work with your hands for 20 years and watch your body break down. You don't know what it's like to worry about getting laid off because you're too old to learn new skills. You don't know what it's like to love a girl who has a daughter that looks at you like you're not good enough. The kettle whistled, and Frank got up to make the tea. Emma sat in the quiet kitchen, feeling the weight of his words. So I deserve to be hit because I hurt his feelings, she asked. Frank set a cup of tea in front of her. You deserve to learn that your words matter. The hitting, that was wrong. But Emma, you can't go through life thinking that other people's feelings don't matter. Emma wrapped her hands around the warm cup. I don't think that, don't you? Frank sat back down. When's the last time you asked David about his day? When's the last time you showed interest in his work, his hobbies, his life? When's the last time you treated him like a person instead of just an obstacle to your college plans? Emma opened her mouth to answer, but realized she couldn't. She tried to remember the last time she'd had a real conversation with David, the last time she'd asked him about anything other than practical matters like rides to school or permission to go out with friends. "I'm not saying you have to be best friends," Frank continued, "but he's your mother's husband. He's trying to be a father to you. The least you can do is treat him with respect." "But what about my respect?" Emma asked, her voice small. "What about treating me with respect?" "Respect is earned, Emma," Frank said, "and it goes both ways." Emma drank her tea and thought about her mother sitting alone in the dark kitchen. She thought about David, who'd looked genuinely horrified at what he'd done. She thought about the college applications on her laptop, about the future she was working toward, about the life she wanted to build for herself. "Grandpa," she said finally, "I think I want to go home." Frank looked at her with surprise. "Are you sure?" Emma nodded. I think I need to apologize." "For what?" "For not seeing David as a person," Emma said. "For not thinking about how my words might hurt him. For not trying harder to be part of this family." Frank smiled, and for the first time all evening, Emma saw the grandfather she remembered. The man who'd taught her to fish, who'd read her bedtime stories, who'd always made her feel loved and safe. "That's my girl," he said. "That's the Emma I raised." But as they drove back through the rain, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. She'd learned something tonight about the adults in her life, about the complexity of families, about the way love and hurt could exist in the same space. She'd also learned that the people she'd always trusted to protect her had their own ideas about what protection meant, and she wasn't sure she agreed with them. Sarah sat at her kitchen table long after Emma had left, staring at the cold pot roast congealing on the plates. The rain had stopped, but the silence in the house felt heavier than the storm. David had gone upstairs an hour ago, claiming he needed to shower, but she could hear him pacing in their bedroom. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Emma's with me. We had a good talk. She's learning." Sarah stared at the message, feeling something cold settle in her stomach. Learning what exactly? That it was okay for grown men to hit teenagers when they got frustrated? That a girl's words could justify a man's violence? She thought about her own childhood, about the way her father had ruled their house with an iron fist disguised as old-fashioned discipline. She'd told herself it was different then, that times had changed, that she was raising Emma differently. But sitting here in the aftermath of what had happened, she realized how little had actually changed. The front door opened, and Emma came in, followed by Frank. Both of them were quiet, and Emma's face was carefully neutral in the way it got when she was processing something difficult. "Mom," Emma said, hanging up her jacket, "can we talk?" Sarah looked at her daughter's face, at the faint red mark that was still visible on her cheek, and felt her heart break all over again. "Of course, sweetheart." Frank cleared his throat. "I'm going to head home. Emma, remember what we talked about?" Emma nodded, but there was something in her eyes that Sarah couldn't read. "Thanks for the ride, Grandpa." After Frank left, Sarah and Emma sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where just hours ago everything had changed. "I'm sorry," Emma said quietly. "I'm sorry for being disrespectful to David. I'm sorry for not thinking about how my words might hurt him. I'm sorry for not trying harder to be part of this family." Sarah studied her daughter's face. The apology sounded rehearsed, like something Emma had been coached to say. "Emma, you don't have to apologize for being hit." "I know," Emma said, but her voice was uncertain. "But I should apologize for my part in what happened." "Your part?" Sarah felt anger rising in her chest. "Emma, you were having a conversation about college. That's not a crime." "But I was being condescending," Emma said. "I was making David feel bad about his job, about his life. Grandpa helped me understand that." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on her. This was exactly how it had worked in her own childhood. The victim taking responsibility for the abuser's actions, the careful passing of words and tone to avoid setting off another explosion. "Emma," she said carefully, "do you think you deserve to be hit?" Emma hesitated, and that hesitation told Sarah everything she needed to know. I think I deserve to face consequences for being disrespectful. And you think being slapped across the face is an appropriate consequence for a teenager expressing her opinions? I think, Emma paused, looking confused. I think I need to be more careful about how I talk to people. Sarah felt something snap inside her chest. Emma, look at me. Emma met her eyes, and Sarah saw her daughter, not the composed teenager sitting across from her, but the little girl who used to crawl into bed with her during thunderstorms, who used to ask a million questions about everything, who used to believe that her mother would always protect her. You did nothing wrong, Sarah said firmly. You were expressing your thoughts about your future. You were being a normal teenager. You did not deserve to be hit, and you do not need to apologize for being hit. But Grandpa said— I don't care what Grandpa said, Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. Emma, I have spent my entire life walking on eggshells, trying not to upset the men in my life, trying to be the perfect daughter and the perfect wife and the perfect mother. And I have watched you start to do the same thing. Emma blinked, looking startled. Mum, I have watched you make yourself smaller, Sarah continued. I have watched you learn to apologize for things that aren't your fault. I have watched you start to believe that your thoughts and feelings and dreams are less important than keeping the peace. Sarah stood up, pacing to the window. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, porch lights reflecting off wet pavement. This was the street where she'd grown up, where she'd learned to be quiet, where she'd learned that love and fear could live in the same house. I grew up in a house where my father's anger was everyone else's responsibility, she said, not turning around. Where my mother tiptoed around his moods, where I learned that being a girl meant being responsible for everyone's emotions except my own. Mom, that's not— It is, Sarah said, turning to face her daughter. Emma, I married your father because I thought he was different, but when he started drinking, when he started getting angry, I found myself making the same excuses my mother had made. I found myself teaching you to be quiet, to be good, to not rock the boat. Emma was quiet, processing. Dad never hit me. No, he didn't, Sarah said, but he hit walls. He threw things. He screamed, and I taught you to hide in your room when he got like that. I taught you that men's anger was something women had to manage. Sarah sat back down, reaching across the table to take Emma's hands. When I married David, I thought I was choosing differently. He's a good man, Emma. He really is. But tonight, when he hit you, I saw the same pattern starting all over again. What pattern? The pattern where women are responsible for men's violence, Sarah said. Where we're told that if we'd just been more respectful, more careful, more aware of their feelings, then they wouldn't have had to hurt us. Emma's eyes filled with tears. But I was being disrespectful. You were being 17 years old, Sarah said. You were expressing your thoughts and feelings. You were talking about your future. None of that justifies violence, Emma. None of it. But what if I really was being condescending? Emma asked. What if I really was making David feel bad? Then the appropriate response would be for David to use his words, Sarah said, to tell you that your comments hurt his feelings, to have an adult conversation about respect and communication, not to hit you. Emma was quiet for a long moment. Grandpa said that respect is earned. And he's right, Sarah said. But Emma, respect doesn't mean silence. It doesn't mean making yourself smaller so that other people feel bigger. It doesn't mean apologizing for having opinions or dreams or thoughts. Then what does it mean? Sarah thought about the question, about the kind of respect she wanted to model for her daughter. I think respect means seeing other people as fully human. It means trying to understand their perspective even when you disagree. It means being kind, even when you're frustrated. But Emma, it also means expecting the same treatment in return. So I shouldn't apologize to David? I think you should have a conversation with David, Sarah said. A real conversation, where you both talk about what happened and how you're feeling. But Emma, you should never apologize for being hit. You should never take responsibility for someone else's violence." Emma wiped her eyes. "What about you, Mum? What are you going to do?" Sarah felt the weight of the question. What was she going to do? David was upstairs, probably torturing himself with guilt and fear. Her father was 8 blocks away, probably convinced that he'd helped solve a family crisis. Her daughter was looking at her, waiting for her to be the mother she'd always promised to be. "I'm going to have a conversation with David too," Sarah said, "about boundaries, about respect, about the kind of family we want to be." "Gosh, and if he doesn't want to have that conversation?" Sarah met her daughter's eyes. "Then we'll figure out what comes next." Emma nodded, looking older than her 17 years. "Mom, I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of everything changing," Emma said. "Of David leaving, of you and David fighting, of having to choose sides." Sarah stood up and walked around the table to hug her daughter. Emma felt small in her arms, younger than her years, like the little girl she'd been before the world got so complicated. "Emma, I can't promise you that everything will stay the same," Sarah said. "I can't promise you that this will be easy, but I can promise you that I will always choose you. I will always choose your safety, your well-being, your right to be heard and respected, even if it means things change, especially if it means things change," Sarah said. "Because, Emma, some things need to change, some patterns need to be broken." They held each other in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the remains of a dinner that had started like so many others and ended like nothing Sarah had ever experienced. Upstairs, David was still pacing. 8 blocks away, her father was probably watching the late news, satisfied that he'd helped his granddaughter learn an important lesson. But here, in this moment, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years: clarity. She knew what she had to do. "Emma," she said, pulling back to look at her daughter, "I want you to know that you can always talk to me about anything, about how you're feeling, about what you're thinking, about what you need. You don't have to make yourself smaller to fit into this family. You don't have to apologize for being who you are. What if who I am causes problems?" Sarah smiled sadly. "Then we'll figure out how to solve those problems together. But Emma, you being yourself is never the problem. You having opinions and dreams and thoughts is never the problem. If other people can't handle that, then that's their problem to solve." Emma nodded, and Sarah saw something shift in her daughter's posture, a straightening, a lifting of shoulders that had been hunched with the weight of responsibility that was never hers to carry. "I love you, Mom," Emma said. "I love you too, baby," Sarah replied, "more than you'll ever know." And for the first time in hours, Sarah felt like she might actually be able to keep her daughter safe, not just from physical harm, but from the kind of slow erosion of self that came from learning to make yourself smaller, from learning to apologize for existing, from learning that love and fear were the same thing. It was time to have a conversation with David. It was time to break the pattern. Sarah found David sitting on the edge of their bed, his head in his hands. He looked up when she entered, and she saw the anguish in his eyes, not just guilt, but genuine horror at what he'd done. "Sarah," he said, standing up, "is Emma okay? Where did she go?" "She's downstairs," Sarah said, closing the door behind her. "She went to my father's house for a while." David's face crumpled. "God, Sarah, I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. I would never... "No, but you did," Sarah said quietly. "You did hit her." "I know," David said, his voice breaking. "I know I did, and I hate myself for it. I hate that I lost control. I hate that I hurt her. I hate that I hurt you." Sarah sat down on the bed, leaving space between them. "David, I need you to help me understand something. What were you thinking in that moment? What made you think it was okay to hit my daughter?" David was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "I don't know if I was thinking at all," he said finally. I was so angry, not just at Emma, but at everything, at losing my job, at feeling like I'm not good enough, at feeling like I'm failing as a husband and a father." "So you took it out on a 17-year-old girl?" "No," David said quickly. "I mean, yes, but not intentionally. Sarah, I swear to you, I didn't wake up this morning planning to hurt Emma. I didn't even know I was capable of something like that. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but all she saw was a man who was genuinely broken by what he'd done. "David," she said carefully, "I need you to understand something. Emma is my daughter. She is my first priority, always, and what happened tonight can never happen again." "It won't," David said immediately. "Sarah, I swear to you, it will never happen again." "How can you promise that?" Sarah asked. "How can you promise that you won't lose control again when you clearly didn't see it coming this time?" David was quiet, and Sarah could see him wrestling with the question. "I don't know," he said finally. "I guess I can't promise that. But Sarah, I want to try. I want to figure out how to be better." "What does that look like to you?" "I don't know," David admitted. "Therapy, maybe. Anger management. I'll do whatever you think I should do." Sarah felt a flicker of hope, but tempered it with caution. "David, I appreciate that you want to change, but I need you to understand that this isn't just about anger management. This is about respect. This is about understanding that Emma is a person with her own thoughts and feelings and dreams, and that those thoughts and feelings and dreams are valid even when they make you uncomfortable." "I know that," David said. "I do respect her." "Do you?" Sarah asked. "Because tonight, when she was talking about college, you heard criticism of your life choices. But David, she wasn't talking about you at all. She was talking about her own future." David was quiet, processing. "Maybe I did take it personally." "You did take it personally," Sarah said, "and that's understandable to a point. But David, Emma is 17 years old. She's figuring out who she wants to be, what she wants to do with her life. She's not responsible for managing your insecurities about your own choices." "I know that," David said. "Intellectually, I know that. But Sarah, it's hard. It's hard to live with someone who's clearly destined for bigger things than you'll ever achieve." Sarah felt her heart soften slightly. "David, why do you think Emma's success somehow diminishes yours?" "Because," David paused, struggling with the words, "because I dropped out of high school to work. Because I've been doing the same job for 20 years. Because when she talks about college and careers and all these opportunities, it reminds me of everything I never had." "And you think that's Emma's fault?" "No," David said quickly. "No, of course not. But it's hard not to feel less than, like I'm not good enough to be her father." Sarah moved closer to him on the bed. "David, you're not her father. You're my husband. And I love you, but you're not Emma's father." David looked stung. "I've been trying to be a father to her." "I know you have," Sarah said gently, "and I appreciate that. But David, Emma already had a father. He wasn't a good one, but she did have one. And she's never asked you to replace him. Then what am I supposed to be to her?" Sarah thought about the question. "I think you're supposed to be David, Emma's stepfather who loves her mother and wants what's best for both of them. Someone who respects her as a person, who supports her dreams, who treats her with kindness. But not her father." "Not her father," Sarah confirmed. "And David, that's okay. That doesn't make you less important to this family. It just makes you different." David nodded slowly. "I think I've been trying so hard to prove that I belong in this family that I forgot to just be myself." "And who is that?" Sarah asked. "Who is David when he's not trying to prove anything?" David smiled sadly. "I honestly don't remember anymore." Sarah reached over and took his hand. "I remember. You're the man who brought me coffee every morning for 6 months before you worked up the courage to ask me out. You're the man who learned to braid hair because Emma mentioned she wished she knew how. You're the man who stayed up all night helping me when my mother was sick." "That feels like a long time ago," David said. "It was only 3 years ago," Sarah said. "David, you're a good man. But good men can still do bad things when they're scared or hurt or angry. The question is what you do next." "What do you think I should do next?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I think you should apologize to Emma. A real apology, where you take full responsibility for what you did and you don't make any excuses. I think you should start therapy to work on understanding why you reacted the way you did." And I think you should have a conversation with Emma about what kind of relationship you two actually want to have. What if she doesn't want any kind of relationship with me? Then you respect that, Sarah said. David, Emma doesn't owe you a relationship just because you married her mother. She doesn't owe you respect just because you pay some of the bills. Relationships are earned, and they're built on trust and mutual respect. And what about us? David asked quietly. What about our marriage? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. I love you, David, but I love my daughter more. And if I have to choose between protecting her and protecting our marriage, I'll choose her every time. I understand, David said, and Sarah could hear the fear in his voice. I hope you do, Sarah said. Because, David, I meant what I said. This can never happen again. Not to Emma, not to me, not to anyone. If you ever raise a hand to either of us again, I will leave, and I will take Emma with me. I understand, David repeated more firmly this time. Good, Sarah said. Now, I think you should go downstairs and apologize to Emma. And then I think you should call a therapist. David nodded and stood up. At the bedroom door, he turned back to her. Sarah, do you think we can get through this? Sarah looked at her husband, this good man who'd made a terrible mistake, who was genuinely remorseful, who wanted to do better. I think that depends on what you do next, she said. But David, I want to try. If you're willing to do the work, I want to try. David nodded and left the room. Sarah sat alone on the bed, listening to his footsteps on the stairs, listening to the quiet murmur of voices from the kitchen as he talked to Emma. She thought about her father, 8 blocks away, who still believed that hitting a teenager was sometimes necessary. She thought about her own childhood, about the lessons she'd learned about keeping the peace and not rocking the boat. She thought about the kind of woman she wanted to be, the kind of mother she wanted to be. For the first time in her life, Sarah Matthews felt like she was choosing herself and her daughter over the comfort of others. It was terrifying. It was also liberating. 3 months later, Emma sat at the same kitchen table, but everything felt different now. Her college acceptance letters were spread out in front of her. Ohio State, University of Cincinnati, Case Western, all acceptances, all with scholarship offers. David sat across from her, reading through the financial aid packages. He'd been going to therapy twice a week since that night in October, and the changes were subtle but real. He listened more. He asked questions instead of making assumptions. He'd stopped trying to be her father and had started trying to be her friend. This one's really good, he said, pointing to the Case Western letter. Full tuition plus a stipend for books. I know, Emma said, but it's in Cleveland. I'm not sure I want to be that far from home. Why not? David asked. You've always talked about wanting to see the world. Emma looked at him, surprised by the question. 3 months ago, David would have been relieved that she was considering staying closer to home. Now, he seemed genuinely curious about her thought process. I don't know, Emma said. I guess I'm not as ready to leave everything behind as I thought I was. Sarah came in from the living room, where she'd been folding laundry. What's not ready? Emma's thinking about staying closer to home for college, David said. Sarah sat down at the table. Any particular reason? Emma looked at both of them, her mother who'd stood up for her when it mattered most, and David, who'd been working so hard to rebuild trust. I guess I like our family better now, she said simply. David's eyes filled with tears. Emma, you shouldn't base your college decision on us. You should go wherever will give you the best opportunities. I know, Emma said. But David, I think I'm finally starting to understand what you meant about family being important too. Joe. Over the past 3 months, Emma had learned things about David that she'd never bothered to ask about before. She'd learned that he'd dropped out of high school to take care of his younger siblings when his father left. She'd learned that he'd been sending money to his mother for 15 years. She'd learned that he read voraciously, that he was interested in history and astronomy, that he had dreams and fears and complicated feelings about his own life. She'd also learned that he was genuinely proud of her accomplishments, that he bragged about her grades to his co-workers, that he'd been secretly setting aside money for her college expenses even when money was tight. You know what I think, Emma said, looking at the acceptance letters. I think I want to go to Ohio State. It's far enough away that I'll get the college experience, but close enough that I can come home for Sunday dinners. Sarah smiled. I think that sounds perfect. David reached across the table and squeezed Emma's hand. I'm proud of you, kid, not just for getting into college, but for giving me a second chance. Thank you for earning it, Emma said. And in that moment, sitting around the same table where everything had fallen apart 3 months earlier, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. Not hope that everything would be perfect. She'd learned that perfection was an impossible standard. But hope that her family could be real, could be honest, could be built on something more solid than fear and silence. The rain started up again outside, drumming against the windows. But inside, the Matthews house was warm and bright and filled with the sound of voices that had learned, finally, how to really listen to each other. Emma picked up the Ohio State acceptance letter and smiled. "So," she said, "who wants to help me plan my dorm room?" And for the first time in months, all 3 of them answered at once. The summer heat in Cincinnati was oppressive, the kind that made the air shimmer above the pavement and drove everyone indoors by mid-afternoon. Emma stood in her childhood bedroom, now transformed into a guest room, packing the last of her belongings into boxes. She was 21 now, a junior at Ohio State studying social work, and this was the final move, from her dorm into her first apartment with her girlfriend Maya. "Need help with that?" David asked from the doorway, gesturing to the heavy box of textbooks. "Thanks," Emma said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "I can't believe how much stuff I accumulated." David lifted the box easily, his construction work keeping him strong despite being 40 now. The therapy had helped with more than just his anger. He'd learned to communicate better, to understand his own emotions, to recognize when he needed to step back and breathe. The changes had been gradual but profound. "Your mom's making lunch," he said. "Turkey sandwiches, your favorite?" Emma smiled. "She's been making my favorite lunch every time I come home for 2 years. I don't have the heart to tell her I'm mostly vegetarian now." "She knows," David said with a grin. "She just likes taking care of you." They carried the boxes downstairs, where Sarah was indeed making turkey sandwiches, humming softly to herself. At 42, she looked younger somehow than she had 2 years ago. The stress lines around her eyes had softened, and there was a lightness to her movements that hadn't been there before. "Perfect timing," she said, setting plates on the table. "Emma, Maya called. She said the moving truck will be there at 3. "Thanks, Mom." Emma sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where everything had changed, where they'd learned to really listen to each other. "I still can't believe I'm finally getting my own place." "Well, technically it's Maya's place too," Sarah said, sitting down across from her. "Our place," Emma corrected. "Maya's been looking forward to meeting you guys properly. You know, when she's not just dropping me off after a date." David sat down with his own sandwich. "We're looking forward to meeting her properly too. Sarah's been planning this dinner for weeks." "I have not been planning," Sarah protested. "I've just been thinking about what to cook." Emma laughed. "Mom, you've asked me 6 times what Maya's favorite food is." "I want her to feel welcome," Sarah said. "I know how important she is to you." Emma felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. 2 years ago, she wasn't sure she'd ever feel comfortable bringing someone home to meet her family. Now, she couldn't wait to share this part of her life with Maya. "Speaking of which," Emma said, "I have something to tell you both." Sarah and David exchanged a glance, and Emma could see the slight tension that always appeared when she said she had news. Even now, after all the progress they'd made, there was still a part of her parents that worried about what she might say. "It's good news," Emma said quickly. "I got accepted into the graduate program at UC, the Masters in Social Work." Sarah's face lit up. "Emma, that's wonderful. When do you start?" "Next fall," Emma said. "But here's the thing. I want to specialize in family counseling, specifically working with families dealing with domestic violence." The table fell quiet. David set down his sandwich, and Sarah's expression became carefully neutral. That's a really important field," Sarah said. "Finally. I know it might be weird," Emma said, considering our history, but I've been thinking about it a lot. About that night, about what happened to us, about how we managed to work through it. David cleared his throat. Emma, you don't have to base your career on what happened in our family. I'm not, Emma said. Not entirely, anyway. But David, what we went through, the bad parts and the good parts, it taught me something important about families, about how people can hurt each other and still love each other, about how change is possible, even when it seems impossible. Sarah reached across the table and took Emma's hand. Are you sure this is what you want? It's going to be emotionally difficult work. I'm sure, Emma said. Mom, I've been volunteering at the women's shelter near campus for the past year. I've been working with teenagers whose stories are a lot like mine. And I feel like maybe I can help them the way you helped me. How did I help you? Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Emma thought about the question. You showed me that I didn't have to accept being hurt. You showed me that I had a voice and that my voice mattered. You chose me, even when it was hard. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Emma, I should have chosen you sooner. I should have protected you from... Mom, stop, Emma said gently. You did protect me. Maybe not in that exact moment, but you protected me from learning to accept abuse as normal. You protected me from thinking that love and fear are the same thing. David was quiet, staring at his hands. Do you think less of me now? He asked quietly. Knowing what you know about domestic violence, about the patterns and the statistics, Emma studied his face. This man who'd been such a complicated figure in her life, who'd hurt her and then worked so hard to make amends. I think you're a person who made a terrible mistake and then did everything in your power to make sure you never made it again. That's a generous way of looking at it, David said. It's an honest way of looking at it, Emma corrected. David, I've learned a lot about domestic violence in the past 2 years. I've learned about the cycle of abuse, about escalation, about all the warning signs. And I've also learned about people who are capable of real change. And you think I'm capable of real change? Emma nodded. I think you've already proven that. You've been in therapy for 2 years. You've learned to communicate differently. You've never raised your voice to me or Mom since that night, even when we've disagreed about things. That's because I'm terrified of losing you both, David said honestly. And that's exactly why I know you've changed, Emma said. Because you care more about our well-being than you do about being right or feeling comfortable. Sarah wiped her eyes. I'm so proud of you, Emma, not just for getting into graduate school, but for who you've become, for the way you've handled all of this. I had good teachers, Emma said, looking at both of them. You taught me that families can survive hard things, that people can learn to do better, that love doesn't have to hurt. The doorbell rang, interrupting the emotional moment. Sarah jumped up. That must be Maya. Emma felt her stomach flutter with nerves. Maya had met her parents briefly before, but this felt different. More official somehow, like she was introducing her family to the person she was planning to build a life with. Maya Chen was 22, a journalism major with long black hair and an infectious laugh. She'd grown up in Columbus, in a family that had immigrated from Taiwan when she was 5, and she had a way of making everyone around her feel comfortable. Hi, Mrs. Matthews, Maya said, giving Sarah a hug. Thank you so much for having me. Please call me Sarah, Sarah said, and thank you for taking care of our Emma at school. I think she takes pretty good care of herself, Maya said with a smile, but I'm happy to help when I can. David stepped forward, and Emma held her breath slightly. The relationship between David and Maya had been polite, but distant the few times they'd met before. Maya, David said, extending his hand. Good to see you again. You too, Mr. Martinez, Maya said, shaking his hand. Emma tells me you're the one who taught her to change a tire. David looked surprised. She mentioned that. She mentions you a lot, actually, Maya said. She's really proud of how hard you've worked to be a good stepdad. Emma saw David's face soften, and she felt a rush of love for Maya, not just for being kind, but for understanding how important these relationships were to Emma. They spent the afternoon moving Emma's things to the new apartment, a small two-bedroom place near campus. David and Maya bonded over their shared love of true crime podcasts, while Sarah and Emma worked on arranging furniture. "I like her," Sarah said quietly as they hung pictures in Emma's new bedroom. "She's good for you." "I think so too," Emma said. "Mum, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever regret it? Staying with David after what happened?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd left immediately," she said. "If that would have been the right thing to do. But Emma, I don't regret fighting for our family. I don't regret believing that people can change, even though it was a risk. Especially because it was a risk," Sarah said. "Emma, I spent so much of my life playing it safe, accepting less than I deserved, settling for okay instead of fighting for good. Staying with David and demanding that he do better. That was the first time I'd ever fought for what I wanted, instead of just accepting what I got." Emma hugged her mother. "I'm glad you fought." "Me too," Sarah said. "But Emma, I want you to know, if David hadn't been willing to do the work, if he hadn't changed, I would have left. You taught me that I was strong enough to leave if I needed to." "How did I teach you that?" "By being brave," Sarah said. "By refusing to accept that being hurt was normal. By demanding better." That evening, they all sat around Emma's new dining table, a small IKEA piece that wobbled slightly, but felt like the most important furniture in the world. Maya had cooked, insisting that she wanted to contribute something to the celebration. "So," David said, raising his glass of iced tea, "to Emma's new apartment, new graduate program, and new adventures. To families that choose to do better," Sarah added. "To second chances," Maya said, looking at David with a meaningful smile. "To not being afraid to take up space," Emma said, thinking about all the ways she'd learned to make herself smaller over the years, and all the ways she'd learned to expand again. They clinked glasses, and Emma looked around the table at these people who'd become her chosen family. Not perfect, not without history, but real and honest and committed to doing better. Later, after her parents had gone home and Maya was in the shower, Emma sat alone in her new living room, looking at the framed photo on the coffee table. It was from her high school graduation, her, Sarah, and David, all smiling at the camera. David's arm was around Sarah's shoulders, and Emma was standing slightly apart, not quite part of the family unit, but not outside it either. She thought about the girl in that photo, still carrying so much anger and fear, still learning how to trust again. She thought about how far they'd all come, how many conversations they'd had, how many small acts of courage had led them to this moment. Her phone buzzed with a text from her grandfather. "Heard about graduate school. Proud of you, sweetheart." Emma stared at the message for a long moment. Her relationship with Frank had been more complicated over the past 2 years. He'd never apologized for his reaction that night, never acknowledged that his advice had been harmful. But he'd also stopped giving unsolicited opinions about Emma's choices, and she'd learned to set boundaries with him while still maintaining a relationship. She texted back, "Thanks, Grandpa. See you soon." It wasn't perfect. None of it was perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs, and it was built on a foundation of truth instead of silence. Maya came out of the bathroom, her hair wrapped in a towel. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, curling up next to Emma on the couch. "Just everything," Emma said. "How different my life is now than it was 2 years ago." "Good different or scary different?" "Both," Emma said, "but mostly good." Maya kissed her temple. "I love your family, even knowing everything about our history. Especially knowing everything about your history," Maya said. "Emma, your family isn't perfect, but they're honest about not being perfect, and they work to do better. That's more than a lot of families can say." Emma leaned into Maya's warmth, feeling grateful for this person who'd chosen to love her, messy history and all. "I think I'm ready," she said. "Ready for what?" "Ready to help other families learn what we learned," Emma said. "Ready to be the person I needed when I was 17. Maya smiled. "I think you're going to be amazing at it." Outside, the Cincinnati summer evening was alive with the sounds of crickets and distant traffic. Inside, Emma's apartment was quiet and peaceful, filled with the promise of new beginnings. For the first time in her life, Emma Matthews felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, surrounded by people who loved her not despite her history, but because of how she'd grown from it. It had taken 2 years, countless difficult conversations, and more courage than she'd known she possessed. But they'd done it. They'd broken the cycle.